Shalom l'kulam, Baruchim habayim. I'm Ron Price, the founding executive vice president of the Union for Traditional Judaism, now emeritus, and the author of Divrei Halev, Thoughts of Rabbi Professor David Weiss Halivni on the weekly Torah portion. It is my honor and my privilege to welcome you to this fourth Yahrzeit commemoration of our beloved teacher. And I believe that the actual Yahrzeit begins tonight. Rabbi Ephraim, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I believe that's the case.
That is correct.
Yes? Okay. This is then the commemoration of the fourth Yahrzeit of our beloved teacher, our mentor, renowned Torah scholar, giant Harav David Weiss Halivni, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. As Rabbi Noah mentioned before, housekeeping is to remind everyone that the program is being recorded. We'd like it if you keep your cameras on, but you don't have to if you don't want to appear. Everyone is muted except for the speakers. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot by listing people who are online with us, who may or may not want to be recognized, but it's important for me to mention a couple of folks. One of them is, of course, our president, Rabbi Professor David Novak, as well as Rabbi Isaac Sassoon, who has been a mentor to many of those who were the students in the Nativta and in the UTJ in general. We're glad you're a part of this. And I also want to make a special thank you that he doesn't expect, but I want to give it to him anyway, to Rabbi Noah Gradovsky, who has spent countless hours learning the technology and the logistics of creating these, setting up and presenting these webinars, not just the Yahrzeit events, but the webinars that UTJ presents throughout the year over the internet. And he does that without remuneration, purely as an act of love for the UTJ and its ideals. And we all, from the UTJ and all those present today, thank him for that.
Thank you.
I also want to thank those who were sponsors of this particular Yahrzeit program. The list of the sponsors has grown, I'm happy to say. It is in the chat, I believe, and I urge you to please take a look at all of the names that are there and think about becoming one of those whose names are there, whether it's tonight or whether it's today for another program. Later on. UTJ is an independent volunteer organization. It does not receive funding from any outside organization, and the contributions that you make are the contributions that keep the organization functioning. So please do consider that as time goes on. For those who are online who may not yet be familiar with the work of the UTJ, I urge you to go to utj.org, utj.org. That is the website of the UTJ, and there you will find plenty of information about who we are and where we came from. Rather than reading out our mission statement, I'll simply say that for tonight in particular, the work that the UTJ does is encapsulated in the phrase that Rav Halivni, Zichrono Livracha, himself created for us. And that is, Emunat Tzrufa v'yosher da'at, genuine faith combined with intellectual integrity. What that means could be a separate all-day shiur, and I hope we will have time to talk about it at some point. But in the meantime, know that that encapsulates what the UTJ is about. Emunah, Sirufa, v'yosher da'at, genuine faith combined with intellectual integrity. And that is enough advertising for now. And so we go forward with our with our program. It is, as I said at the beginning, hard to accept that this is the conclusion of the fourth year that our teacher is physically absent. He is no longer physically in our midst. And I found in Masechet Horayot, the end of Tractate Horayot, on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph 13a in the Talmud, a statement that I think sums up how we're feeling on this eve of Rav Halivni's Yahrzeit. There's a discussion about priorities. Who takes priority over whom when it comes to, in particular, freeing them from imprisonment? I'm sure some of you are familiar with this from the Sugyan Bava Metzia, and as well as in Hilchot Talmud Torah from the Rambam. But here there's a twist, which I think is important. The Gemara says, Tno Rabbanan, Hayahu va'aviv rabo bashevi, hu kodem l'rabo. If a person and his father and his rabbi, his teacher, are imprisoned, he, meaning you yourself, if you're one of them, kodem l'rabo, you take precedence. Your life takes precedence over that of your rabbi, of your teacher. V'rabo kodem la'aviv, and his teacher, your teacher, takes precedence over your father. Again, discussion on that, but not for now. And a line that's added here that doesn't appear elsewhere is Imo kodemet l'kulam. But if the mother is also included in the capture, in the imprisonment, she takes precedence over everybody, right? Over the teacher, over the rabbi, over you, your father, etc. The next line is what I want to focus on. Chacham kodem lemelech Yisrael. A sage takes precedence over a king of Israel. The Chacham takes precedence over a king of Israel. And we obviously ask, why? How can that be that a sage takes precedence over the king? The Gemara answers, Chacham shemet ein lanu kayot sebo. When a sage dies, there is no replacement. There is no one like him. Melech Yisrael shemet kol Yisrael re'uyim lamalchut. If a king of Israel dies, well, everyone, every Jew is qualified to replace him, to be a king, to be part of royalty. Chacham shemet ein kayotze bo. The sage who dies, we have no one like him to replace him. Our meeting together now, today, reminds us that Rav Halivni's Torah and his influence does remain in this world. He's not replaceable. His Torah is also not replaceable, but we still have it. So even if we don't have him in this world, his Torah is with us. The model that he was for us is with us, and we can continue to adhere to it and follow the example that he set for us. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Avidan Halivni. You recognize the last name. Avidan is the grandson of our sorely missed Rebbe and mentor. He carries on, I think, in a significant measure, the will of his grandfather and the fact that he is the director of learning for the Jewish Learning Collaborative. He lives in Chicago, and his mission is to create Jewish learning opportunities for Jews, regardless of their background, one-on-one, all around the world. And I understand thus far his programs have provided tens of thousands of hours of Jewish learning to hundreds of Jews throughout various countries around the world. And certainly that mission would make his grandfather proud. With that, Avidan will share some memories of his son. Avidan, please.
Thank you, Rabbi Price. Thank you all for gathering here today and for offering me the chance to speak about my Saba. The grandfather-grandson relationship, I think is a very special one and has um, been very special to me for as long as I can remember. But sometimes it was hard to understand what I mean, there was something about the access I had to this figure that others didn't seem to understand. They would say, "What is it like to have these conversations together?" Or "What is it like to go on walks together as we did regularly when I was in Israel?" And I would say, "What do you mean? It's so easy. You pick up the phone and call." Right. So there were ways that um, I didn't quite understand the uniqueness of that relationship until I came to have relationships with teachers of my own. Um, and the way that those teachers who had learned from him related to him, that was a way for me to understand the gedula, or the sort of gravitas of the way he moved throughout the world. So I'll share two memories that continue to resonate with me. The first is when I was in yeshiva. I was at Yeshivat Mali Gilboa, and as a Shana Aleph kid in an Israeli yeshiva, I was at the bottom of the totem pole, right? The language, I was at a disadvantage with the language. I was coming in, right? There were others in the yeshiva that were much more advanced in their own learning. And so I was in the back of the room, as it were. And then the day that Saba came to give Shiur Klali, that came to yeshiva, made the schlep all the way up to the Gilboa. That was the day that I got to sit at the Rebbe's table, at the Rosh Yeshiva table, with him for lunch. And as we all ate our schnitzel, and certainly everyone there was a big aficionado of schnitzel, um, just watching the way, the kavod with which the Rosh Yeshiva and everyone else in the room related to him, I saw, okay, wow, like this, like the impact that he has made on these people that I look up to, right? That there was a way that actually the grandfather relationship was quite informal and loving and joking, that I sometimes had difficulty squaring everything that everyone else had said about him with the figure that I knew and had a relationship and would talk with before Shabbos, but only through the eyes of my teachers did I come to really understand the man himself. Um, and that was one episode. Certainly in the world of Torah, that at least made sense to me. But when I got to college, when I got to Columbia, one of the first classes I took was with a professor in the religion department named Courtney Bender, who was a junior scholar right when my Saba was finishing up his tenure. And she stopped me after one of the classes and just shared that when she first started, in the early 2000s, that my Saba was always so kind to her, would ask about her career, would give her unsolicited advice on what to name her sons, and again, right, the same respect and interest to the Rosh Yeshiva as to the junior scholar in the hallways of the religion department. That more than anything makes me swell with pride of what it means to be a thoughtful and caring person moving throughout the world. And as I've heard these stories, and I think they're quite emblematic of the grandchild relationship, right? In a ways, right? It's not a direct one, right? Go parent, child, grandchild. So I've heard plenty of those stories from, my parents and aunts and uncles and so on. But I've also heard the indirect stories from those students, and in a way, those also feel like grandfather stories, right? To be the student of the student is like being the child of the child, and all of those stories are immediate. Every mention of the intellectual prowess is immediately followed up with the menschlichkeit, And that more than anything is the Keter Shem Tov that I feel that I carry with me. Is that hybrid, is that very important hybrid. Um, I'll share one more piece, just of something that I've been thinking about lately, vis-a-vis my own life, and Rabbi Price shared just a bit about my own work. Um, I came across a piece from Rav Hutner, about the idea that, Eliyahu, he takes the Gemara in Tani about how Yaakov Avinu did not die, right? And the Gemara says, "What do you mean, right? Was it for nothing that they did Hespedim?" And he says, "No, I'm doing drash," and connects Yaakov to Eliyahu, that Eliyahu doesn't die in the Pshat, and so Yaakov doesn't die in the drash. And the way Rav Hutner plays that out is he says sometimes there are, I would say, appearances of someone else's drash dimension, right? He calls it panim shel drash, panim shel pshat. I prefer to render it as pshat dimension and drash dimension. Um, is that there are elements of someone else's drash that manifest in our own pshat. And so I don't think or I would dare say others on this call, feel the need to live out, my grandfather's pshat, right? The events of his life, and the ideas that he put out into the world and the relationships that he had, those speak for themselves. But perhaps on a drash dimension, right? Those pop out, at ways that when we least expect it. And part of the ways that I see my own choices, and also, wading into, the world of Torah and Jewish communal leadership, is living out that pshat, is the drash, excuse me, is living out, that, alternate dimension that it doesn't look the same. And right, I was born in America is going to look different than someone who was born in Europe. But that same ethos of commitment to Torah and commitment to the Jewish people, that shows up in all of our lives, on a midrashic level, um, and in ways that I think carry that same ethos. And of course, seeing everyone on this call today, knowing, and hearing the kavod and respect and relationship, that all of you, carry with you, is, just makes me feel with that same pride.
Thank you, Avidan. Our next speaker carries the same last name, Rabbi Dr. Ephraim Halivni, who is the middle son of our teacher. Most of you know, I think, that when Rav Halivni came to the States as a 17-year-old orphan from the Holocaust, but also already carrying smicha, he was introduced to many different gedolim of the day, in America. Rav Aaron Kotler, Rav Tomasha, there are others that are mentioned, also mentioned in his book, The Book and the Sword. But when he met Professor Shaul Lieberman, the Garash, HaGaon Rabbeinu Shaul, things changed. The trajectory of his future in learning shifted, and influenced him for the rest of Professor Lieberman's life. Obviously, they were very close. Rabbi Ephraim Halivni is going to talk today about some of the interactions between his father, Rav Halivni, and Professor Lieberman, and I'm very anxious to hear them, so I'm going to synopsize quickly that Ephraim B'Tzalel Halivni had his BA from Columbia, an MA from the Jewish Theological Seminary, a PhD from Bar Ilan University. He studied for a number of years at Yeshivat Har Etzion, received his smicha from the chief rabbinate in Israel. And I have the zechut to say that I think I was responsible for one of the first places he taught, that is the Metifta, our own rabbinical program, where he influenced the lives of a number of rabbis who are now functioning both in Israel and in the United States. With that, it's my pleasure to call upon Rabbi Ephraim Halivni. B'vakasha.
Thank you, Rabbi Price. I would like to thank Rabbi Gradovsky and Rabbi Price for organizing this event and giving me the opportunity to speak. As Rabbi Price said, I would like to share with you some interactions between my father Zal and Rabbi Lieberman Zal. First, I'll mention, as Rabbi Price also mentioned, that my father's affiliation at JTS revolved in large measure around Rabbi Lieberman. First, his decision to come to JTS was mainly to be able to study with Rabbi Lieberman. And his decision to leave JTS over the issue of ordination for women also revolved in some measure around Rabbi Lieberman. And to clarify that latter point, I will first present a brief summary of the chronology of the decision to admit women to the rabbinical school of JTS. In 1977, Professor Gershon Cohen, the chancellor at the time, brought up the issue and formed a commission that was to study the matter for 2 years. In the course of those 2 years, it became pretty clear that Professor Cohen himself was in favor of this, and as many in the Talmud department, from Rabbi Lieberman to my father and Professor Frankis, were opposed to the idea. Rabbi Lieberman, let it know that he didn't like the idea, but he wasn't all that active in the matter and trying to influence the decision. So the leadership of the opposition fell largely on my father's shoulders. And in 1979, the commission issued its report. The overwhelming majority of members favored the rabbinic ordination for women. In 1980, the issue was brought up at the Senate, in the JTS, and the overwhelming majority rejected the motion at that time, not on intrinsic grounds, but rather you might call practical considerations. Now is not the right time, too many divisions. So it was put on the back burner for a while. In the fall of 1983, it suddenly came up. It came up again, this time with great momentum, and the measure passed with a pretty large majority to take effect immediately, meaning the class entering in 1984 should include women. And one of those women was Amy Albert, someone who had studied at JTS for quite some time under different framework, and therefore she, in that other framework, had taken many of the courses that were required for rabbinical school. So she was able to graduate 1 year later in 1985, the first female to be ordained by JTS. Now, what happened to move this thing along so quickly starting in 1983? There were two factors. Number one was Cohen's failing health. Dr. Cohen's health, as I said, was failing, and he very much wanted to see this issue through while he was still around. So as I said, he pushed it, in 1983, and the first woman graduated in 1985, and he resigned or retired early in 1966. I'm sorry, in 1986 at the age of 61 for health reasons. And indeed, just a few years later in 1991, he passed away, all of 66. So that was one significant factor. The other significant factor, more relevant to this discussion, was Rabbi Lieberman's passing in the spring of 1983. Now, how was Rabbi Lieberman's presence a factor in all this? I can't say for sure. On a practical level, Rabbi Lieberman was rabbi of the shul, and I don't believe the chancellor had authority to overrule him. And presumably, Rabbi Lieberman would have kept the shul the way it was. And it would have been mighty awkward to have women in the rabbinical school, but the shul would not be egalitarian. Just to give one situation that comes to mind, in those days, the practice was that the members of the graduating class gave the sermon Shabbat morning during the academic year. And the custom was that the senior sermon got an aliyah, usually Revi. I can just imagine a situation where you have female students who are about to graduate and therefore giving sermons, and the male students get an aliyah and the female ones did not. That, I assume, would not go over well with some people. But in addition to that practical matter, it seems, certainly with the benefit of hindsight, that somehow Rabbi Lieberman's presence, even though practically speaking he didn't do very much, if I'm not mistaken, he didn't even always vote on the relevant Senate votes, but I'm not sure of that. And somehow his presence, his stature, prevented the decision from being made. And therefore, when he passed away, Cohen felt that now he can get it through, and indeed he did. So, and in the aftermath of that, shortly after Cohen's resignation, my father resigned. I don't remember the exact date, but I do remember that my father handed in his letter of resignation to Professor Ismar Shorsh, Cohen's successor as chancellor. So I have some sense of the date. So in that sense, my father's departure from JTS also revolved around Rabbi Lieberman. And if one wants to look at a wider perspective, you can say that my father's affiliation with JTS was one long interaction with Rabbi Lieberman. And now I'd like to present some more specific interactions. At some point, I think, I'm guessing it was in the early 60s, my father came up with an interesting idea about a particular phrase in Yerushalmi, what exactly it means. So he sounded out his idea with Rabbi Lieberman. Rabbi Lieberman listens, initially didn't say anything. A couple of days later, Rabbi Lieberman gets back to him and says, I thought about your idea and I think you have a valid point. but I can say it and you can't. How so? Because I went through the whole Yerushalmi and I checked it out. So you see here this interesting interaction between a young scholar who has an interesting idea. He sounds it out with his teacher, a more senior scholar. And the senior, Rabbi Lieberman, approves it, but as he says, the idea has to be checked out. Now, how do you check things out in the Yerushalmi? You have to remember that was the days, if you can recall, that such an error really existed. There's not only no computer, no projector shoot, there wasn't even a concordance to the Yerushalmi. So how do you check things out through the Yerushalmi? Well, one way of doing that was to sound it out with Rabbi Lieberman. So here we see Rabbi Lieberman's unmatched Bikias, and so on this interaction, they both were in sync. You know, as I said, Rabbi Lieberman agreed with my father's idea, but the confirmation of it came only after Rabbi Lieberman was able to check it out through the Yerushalmi, throughout the Yerushalmi. Next, I'd like to present some potential interactions that didn't take place because one of the parties avoided it. The first such story I'll share with you is concerns my father's doctorate. In the mid-50s, he was working on a doctorate for Rabbi Lieberman on a particular Perush on Tanit from a JTS manuscript, about publishing the commentary and making notes. As I assume many of you know, that was later published as a book by Messiah Rav Kook, Sridim in Perush Rav Tanit. My father says that when he submitted the doctorate, Rabbi Lieberman didn't read it too much, just kind of moved it along. And it's not because he didn't have what to say, because after all, a few years later, when Rabbi Lieberman wrote on his Tosefta Kipshuta on Tanit, he used that commentary, and in the course of Tosefta Kipshuta Tanit makes many remarks about it. But apparently, earlier, when my father submitted it as a doctorate thing, Rabbi Lieberman, as the thesis advisor, had to approve it. He just moved it along more or less almost automatically. So in that case, it was Rabbi Lieberman who kind of sidestepped what could have been a potential interaction. The next case I'd like to share with you is a few years later, in late 60s, as my father was looking to publish his first volume of Makoret and Masarot, the Nashim volume. So he approached Professor Louis Finkelstein, the chancellor at the time, and asked him for funding. So Professor Finkelstein said, well, let me first submit the manuscript to Rabbi Lieberman for him to look over. My father was uncomfortable with that because, as is known, Rabbi Lieberman did not directly engage in what we call higher criticism, development of the Sugya, and was uncomfortable with it. And my father was concerned that Rabbi Lieberman would put some obstacles in the way of publishing the book. So my father decided to dodge the matter, that he would look elsewhere for funding and not hand the book to Professor Finkelstein to hand to Rabbi Lieberman. I did mention to my father over the years, as he told me the story, I said, put yourself in Professor Finkelstein's shoes. Don't you think that was a reasonable thing to do? Here you have a young scholar publishing not his very first book, but his first substantive book. And here you have Rabbi Lieberman, Gadol Me'Rabban Shmo. It doesn't make sense that he should look over such a book. If you and Rabbi Finkelstein's Jews, wouldn't you do the same thing? My father kind of shrugged at me, but can't really disagree with that. But anyway, my father basically bypassed Professor Finkelstein because of this matter, and found alternate sources of funding. Though in the middle of the process, Professor Finkelstein on his own came over to him and said, oh yes, here's some funding for the book. Now, what would Rabbi Lieberman have done had he reviewed the book before publication? Of course, I can't say for sure. In the parts of Tosefta Kipshuta that I'm familiar with, he does not directly attack this sort of scholarship. After all, many of those around him, including his teacher, Professor Yaakov Nachum Epstein, dealt with it. And whereas most of the Masechtot of Tosefta Kipshuta came out before their counterparts in Makorot and Masorot, the latter part of Kiddushin Tosefta Kipshuta was published a few years after Makorot and Masorot, and I've gone through chunks of it. And yes, he makes some comments, but nothing that suggests to me that he thought it was off the pale and would have blocked publication. But that of course, is all speculation. As I said, in this case, this potential interaction, my father avoided. The last interaction I'd like to share with you is multi-layered. Begins with my father told me that Rabbi Lieberman told him that Rabbi Lieberman, gave instructions that on his matzeva, his meaning, Rabbi Lieberman, his own matzeva, that his matzeva should contain basic personal information, name, date of birth, date of passing, but no mention of scholarship. My father didn't like that. He tried to dissuade him. He said, but nobody will recognize it. But Rabbi Lieberman was not swayed, and indeed, Rabbi Lieberman's matzeva does not contain any mention of his scholarship. Over the years, I told this story many times with a couple of my own additions. Number one, that Professor Yaakov Nachum Epstein, who is buried not too far from Rabbi Lieberman in Sanhedria, also did the same. His tombstone contains his name, date of birth, when he passed away, no mention of the scholarship. And I take this a step further, both vis-a-vis Rabbi Lieberman and vis-a-vis Professor Epstein, that both the name Lieberman and the name Epstein are quite common names. So how are people going to recognize them? And now the final layer of this story. Recently, I went to the Mechona Talmudei Yisraeli Shalem, institute that publishes books, Dikdukei Sofrim Shalem and volumes of Meiri, located at the Yeshua Shul on Rehov Melech George in Yerushalayim. I went there recently to buy a book. I walked in there into their Beit Midrash, And I see that there's a cubicle there with the name of Rav Shaul Lieberman. I was surprised. First of all, I didn't know he had such a connection there, and that they would preserve it, so many years after he passed away, and they changed locations. Somebody there explained to me that this Rav Shaul Lieberman is not the big scholar of the Tosefta. It's a namesake of his who's alive today. As though he's just proving my point that the name Shaul Lieberman is so common, and that without any indication on the tombstone, some people may not recognize it. My father, by contrast, for one, changed the name to Halivni, which is not a common name. As far as we know, only we have it. And secondly, in accordance with his instructions, we wrote on his tombstone, מניצולי השואה אשר רוב ימיו הקדיש ללימוד התורה ולהפצתה. I'm translated into English. I mean, the tombstone contains only the Hebrew. From amongst the refugees or survivors of the Holocaust, who dedicated most of his life to learning Torah and disseminating it. And he investigated, that's a bit of a loose translation of the sources of the Talmud and its traditions, obviously echoing his book, the title of his book, Makor to Masorot, Kasher Hen Ktuvim al Hasfarim Shekatav, as it is written on the books in which he published. So his situation in this regard is different. But I will end off by saying that in accordance with the general custom, the last line, both on Rabbi Lieberman's matzeva and my father's matzeva, is Tav Nun Tzadi Bet Hey. Tehei Nishmato Tzrura Itzror HaChayim. Thank you for tuning in.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Ephraim Halivni. Our final speaker is Rabbi Dr. Zvi Leshem, who is going to be speaking about Unpublished, a first glimpse of the archives of Rav Halivni at the National Library of Israel. Rabbi Dr. Leshem has a special zika, a special connection to Rav Halivni, Zichrono Livracha, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Rabbi Leshem studied at Yeshivat HaMivtar. He also has smicha from the chief rabbinate of Israel. He holds a PhD in Jewish thought from Bar Ilan University. Rabbi Leshem directed the Gershom Shalom collection for Kabbalah and Hasidism at the National Library of Israel from 2011 until his retirement in 2024. He previously served in senior positions in Jewish education and as a community rabbi. And his research focuses on Hasidism, Jewish education, Gershom Shalom, and postmodern religious thought of Rav Shagar. And Rabbi Leshem was a close student and friend of Rav Halivni for almost 50 years. Rav Leshem and his wife live here in Yerushalayim with their 6 children and many grandchildren who live all over Israel. Rabbi Leshem is the author of Redemption, Contemporary Hasidic Essays on the Parashah and the Festivals, published in 2006, and many of his academic and rabbinic articles are available on his academia.edu page, and there should be a link to that site in our chat. It's my pleasure now, or my privilege, to call upon Rabbi Leshem to speak about the as yet unpublished information and material in the archives on Rav Halivni at the National Library of Israel.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Price, and also Rabbi Grodowski and all the leadership of the UTJ for the invitation to speak. Thank you very much to all the leadership, and it's a very great privilege and honor for me to speak here at the Yahrzeit of my teacher and mentor and Rebbe, Harav David Halivni Zatzal, and my word should be Le'ilui Nishmato. I'm excited to present for you material which most of you have probably never seen before. The description, I want to describe a little bit of the archive, but first of all, the history of the archive. After Rabbi Halivni passed away, the archive was given by his family, his sons, to the National Library of Israel. It's a relatively small archive. It includes only 3 boxes, 2 of materials that were written by Rav Halivni, which is what we'll focus on, and a third containing material written about him, which is less interesting to me at this time. And I'm studying this material together with my dear friend Rav Shalom Matan Shalom, who was actually the last student of Rav Halivni, that he, in the last year of his life, would go every week or so to his apartment to learn with him. And I couldn't resist putting in one of many pictures that we have from family events with Rav Lieberman. This is in 1985 in our shul in Har Nof at the bris of my son Maayan. You can see a Rav Halivni in the bottom left is the Sandak, Ephraim above him looking on, Rav Ephraim, me standing there holding the knife, appointing the legendary Jerusalem Moil, Vyasla Weisberg, who's in the bottom right, about to do the bris. Okay, so what have we got here in the archive? First of all, I want to show you a picture of Dr. Anot Navod, who works in the archive department of the National Library, and she is the person who was given the job of cataloging the archive. So I won't go into that process. It's not relevant to us, but she gets a lot of credit for the work that Shalom Matan Shalom and I am able to do at this point. It says her on the top right, and just one of the many, many, many rows of the boxes that contain the approximately 1,000 personal archives that are held by the National Library. Okay, what have we got in this archive? Let's describe it a little bit more. There's about half in Hebrew and about half in English, 2 Yiddish poems, which we'll see a little later on, and surprisingly, a lot of Italian, mostly translations of articles and parts of books of Rav Halivni. Apparently, he has some fans in Italy. Sadly, much of the material, the majority is not dated, which makes our work a lot harder to understand even the order of things. For example, when we get to sermons, there's about 16 to 20 sermons. None of them have dates on them. So we'll talk about that later when we see some of them. We've identified over 600 pages that are seemingly not published and seem to be very significant. When I say significant, I would say that what I'm not including here is there's a tremendous amount of pages of Perushim on different Gemaras, but our impression is that most of those eventually made their way into Makor Mesorot, so that's less significant for us, especially since they're not the final version, as opposed to other material which is not published at all, which includes letters, sermons, approximately, as I said, 16 sermons, mostly Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, a little bit of Parshat HaShavua. We have one Sheila Tshuva about gelatin, which we'll look at later. There are quite a number of notes from lectures, unpublished articles, and many drafts of articles and lectures that were later published. There are notes and drafts also for parts of his books and for articles. The comments on rabbinic literature is what I've mentioned. They're not only on the Gemara, some of them are also on Midrashei Halacha and the Mechilta primarily. And as we'll see, there are a number of interesting personal reflections of various sorts and reflections on his theological musings, on the implications of his critical study of the Talmud, and last but not least, 2 poems in Yiddish. Okay, so let's start to see a couple of examples from each of these genres. Okay, this is the smicha that Rav Halivni received that was mentioned by Rabbi Price from Rav Tamashav. We all know that he had smicha from the dying of Sighet, Rav Gross, from before the Shoah. And when he came to New York, he went to Rav Tamashov, who was known as one of the Litvish Gedolim in New York, and he told me later that he felt that it would be good for him to also have a smicha from a Litvish gadol in addition to a Hungarian gadol. And later, of course, he also got smicha from Rav Lieberman at JTS. This text was, people may have read it in Erwin Haut's book, The Talmud as Law or Literature, where there's a transcription of the text. But I think this is the first time that maybe that you're seeing, or anyone is seeing, pretty much, the actual handwritten smicha from Rav Tomashov. The reason it looks so light is that the paper is fading, unfortunately. It's not in good condition. But it includes, of course, the line of that this young man, who at this time was maybe 21 years old, is destined to become one of the greatest gaonim of his generations. It's a very beautiful and powerful smicha document. Unfortunately, the one from Sighet was lost in the Shoah. We don't, as far as I know, we don't know what the text said. Here's the tshuva that I mentioned about gelatin. This is a very, very interesting tshuva. It's written in 1951, when the Rav would have been approximately 24. And it's basically a classic tshuva about the use of the bones of non-kosher animals to make gelatin, and if that gelatin is permissible to consume or not. It's a 7-page tshuva. You see here on the right the first page, and on the left the last page. And it's a very, very, very impressive tour de force of quoting Rishonim and Achronim and Poskim, and a classic kind of halachic pilpul, maybe in the Hungarian style. Very, very powerful and convincing. And he ends with saying, the last three lines on the left-hand page, all of this is only theoretical halacha, but not for practical application. I'm a young man, which was true. Torati eina emunati. My Torah is not my main profession. I'm not sure what he meant by that, unless he's implying the fact that he was at that time in university. And now the line, which is clearly very humble, Yediati b'shas v'poskim mukbelet. My knowledge of Shas and Poskim is limited. We know that's not exactly the case, and therefore, l'chein ani oser lismoch alai lema'aseh. I forbid anyone from relying on me, halacha lema'aseh. Signed, David Hakatan Weiss, the young David Weiss. Okay. This is the only document in the archive which deals with a halachic issue, other than his tshuva about why it's not allowed to ordain women the rabbinate, going back to what Rav Ephraim spoke about, which was published in the collection of JTS Responsa on that topic. So here we have a really lovely early personal, not really personal, but sort of personal spiritual reflection titled A Definition of a Religious Personality. I first saw this when the Rav Halivni's sons were sitting Shiva in his apartment in Yerushalayim. One of the times I was there, I saw this page lying around, and it caught my attention. Then I later saw it when the archive was available. By the way, the archive, I went through it even before it was cataloged to get an idea of what was going on, and then I had to let it go for a while till the work was done, and then it could go back to it. So this is, first of all, very, very beautiful English for someone who's only been in the States for 5 years at this point, approximately. By the way, on this topic, I remember that he once said to us in the Shi'ur that he was amazed at how good the English was of Jastrow, Marcus Jastrow, who had written the Jastrow Dictionary of the Talmud, the Aramaic English dictionary that he had come to America from Poland at such a late stage. But here you have a similar phenomenon, beautiful, beautiful writing at this early stage, describing what it's like to be a person of religion, not a Jewish person. There's nothing Jewish here. It's not particularistic. It's a universalistic kind of analysis, and includes a beautiful line. He emanates a kind of beauty mixed with innocence, not unlike that of a child. Here we have an early draft and then what was, I guess, a later draft of a resume um, from not later than 1957, which it goes up to. The one on the left is the first draft, which is crossed out, marked up, etc. And then the one on the right is what came out of it. The one on the right is clearly more polished and more professional than the one on the left. And both of them say that Rav Halivni was born in Sighet, which we all know from his autobiography is not the case. He was born in Czechoslovakia, came to Sighet at approximately the age of 3. So it's not clear to me why I guess he maybe wanted to put in a town that people had heard of and not a tiny village that was unknown. The Holocaust aspects mentioned in the original draft of being in German concentration camps, Auschwitz, etc., is left out of the second, clearly more professional draft. And I would also make note of the MA thesis, which on the polished one just lists that in 1957 he received an MA in philosophy from New York University. If you look at the left-hand side, he discusses what it was about. He says, thesis, some aspects of Paul Tillich's theology, supervisor Professor Sidney Hook, which is all very, very interesting. This MA thesis, to the best of my knowledge, and after a lot of work trying to clarify this, is missing. The family didn't have a copy, as far as I know. The archive doesn't have a copy. All the relevant universities that one would think would have a copy don't have a copy. And I just think this would be a fascinating thing to see what the young Rav Halivni was writing about Paul Tillich, a liberal Protestant theologian, back in the 1950s. And if anyone has any idea of how to find this, it would be a very big contribution to scholarship about Rav Halivni to share it with us. So please, if anyone knows how to find this, please do share that information. Rav Ephraim spoke about the relationship of Rav Lieberman and his student Rav Halivni. So even though Rav Halivni only made Aliyah in, I think, 2005, we see here that the idea of making Aliyah goes back at least as far as 1967, when he had apparently applied for a position at Bar Ilan University. And we have here a letter of recommendation from Agrash Lieberman to Professor Yammer at Bar Ilan, a beautiful recommendation where he says, Hini samech lodia lecha Professor David Halivni Weiss Ra'ui lehitmanot leprofessor min haminyan b'chol universitah. Hu ra'ui u'muchshar lekach, bein mibachinat mada'it ubein mibachinat komato ha'ishit, that he is absolutely appropriate to be taken as a full professor in any university, both from a scholarly standpoint and according to his personal stature. Lovely document. But for some reason, I'm not managing to move to the next picture. Oh, here we go. Okay. Here we have another one of our reflections, self-reflections on his own scholarship. Unfortunately, again, not dated. The scribbled numbers on the top are not dates. This is not from 1949 or anything like that. And he says that the purpose of most of his books and articles is to understand the rabbinic tradition, how it developed, etc. This is to help him understand Jewish people, their history, their extraordinary survival. And he ends very eloquently: to understand the secret of rabbinic creativity is tantamount to understanding the secret of Jewish survival. And in doing so, one becomes like a partner in the divine creation, which obviously we know that phrase from rabbinic literature and other contexts. Okay, Rav Halivni didn't only think, let's say, positively or romantically about his research. He also realized that it was potentially dangerous from a religious perspective. He also realized that there were risks involved in the kind of study that he was embarking on. And here, again, sadly with no date. He wrote for himself, apparently, modern Talmudic research as a means of secularization, and addresses 3 ways, very briefly, of course, 3 ways that modern Talmudic research could lead someone towards becoming less religious or becoming more secular. Outside influences, psychological inclinations, and not having the full information. These are all 3 different ways. I'm not going to go into it now. He does state at the bottom in a note, so to speak, that C is the most fiercely opposed, presumably by the more orthodox way of approaching Talmudic texts. But again, we see this, and we see this in a number of other documents as well, that he was clearly aware that his whole approach was complicated and had complicated ramifications as well in the religious realm, which we'll maybe touch on that a little bit later as well. Here's another one of these kind of reflections on his own work. This one's a little bit more formal, a summary. When I first read this, it seemed to me for sure that it must have been published, and I really looked over and over again in all his books, in the Hebrew, in the introductions, and in the English introductions, and the closest thing that I found is that it's sort of similar to his introduction to the book edited by Professor Rubinstein, The Formulation of the Babylonian Talmud. But he starts out by talking about his difficulty with forced interpretations. Dichukim goes back to when he was a child and would cry when he couldn't explain a text according to the simple meaning. This, if those of you remember, in his autobiography, which, by the way, when I talked to him, he never used the word autobiographia or memoirs. He would always say Sefer HaZichronot. He says it there in the context of learning Mishnah and Kilayim, that he couldn't get pshat in, and he was crying, and his grandfather, Rabbi Yeshaya, was not able to help him because he said at that time, he already knows everything that I know, which was quite an astounding statement. In any event, this wasn't published certainly not in these words, and it was written clearly after the introduction to Baba Batra in Makor Masor, as we see from the last printed line, I believe 2008. And then he adds, after 40 years, I'm still concerned with forced interpretations, etc. That's still his topic for so many, many years. Here's a fragment. It looks very much like a page from one of the many sermons that I mentioned, but I don't think it is. It seems to stand on its own, and it's very sweet. And he says, what if the goy who had gone to Hillel and Shammai to ask him, teach me the whole Torah while you're standing on one foot, what if he'd come to me and asked me that question? I would have told him that the answer is to be constantly aware of God's presence at all times is the essence of Judaism. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. And then underline, Judaism is a God-obsessed religion. The mitzvot are designed to make man more sensitive of God's presence, to enable man to be in constant communion with the divine. I would say this is a very Hasidic document. We know that the Rav came from a very, very powerful Hasidic background and had a much Hasidic style in his persona, if not in his scholarship. And here you have it. What are the goal? The goal is to be aware of Hashem's presence at all times. That's a major tenet of Hasidism. The goal is that all the mitzvot will be a way to achieve constant communion with the divine. This is straight out of the Zohar, actually, that the 613 mitzvot are Taryag 18, 613 ways of advice of how to achieve the mitzvah of Botidbak. This is a great little note, a little tzeitel, little petek, which is clearly related both to the Talmudic methodology, but also to the Holocaust theology. It was expressed eventually in the book Breaking the Tablets and other articles. And I recall my friend, Professor Ari Ackerman, has an article on how the Holocaust theology is connected to the Talmudic methodology. So we have in the Rav's handwriting, Rav Theologia Shel Halivni, his theology, Tzimtzum, which we told in the note is both has to do with creation and in history. And we know that the Rav did use the Lurianic concept of Tzimtzum in his Holocaust theology very strongly. Okay, so Tzimtzum is interrelated with divine hiddenness. Tzimtzum is paradoxically or counterintuitively related with Torah Min HaShamayim. Once Torah is no longer Min HaShamayim, in the story of Tanur Shalachnai and Bava Metzia, that leads us also to even a mistaken halacha, which reminds us, of course, of the Rosh Hashanah Mishnah about Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua about Yom Kippur. Nonetheless, the halacha stands, even if based on a mistake. And that leads us ultimately to the Rav's dichotomy between Torat Emet, which is his pshat approach to understanding text, and Torat Chaim, which is halacha, and how the two are separate tracks, which one has to be careful not to confuse. Now I want to look at one of the sermons. As I said, there's about 16 sermons for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, as well as one or two Parsha Hashavua sermons. They're not dated, sadly. You can sort of figure out the dates, the approximate dates from the context, from the contents sometimes. This one would seem to be for from the mid-1960s, as it clearly alludes to the Cold War and I think probably the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which was when the world was really on the brink of a possible atomic war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And he calls the sermon a perfect heart. In the middle here we see on the right line, the fear of atomic destruction was everywhere. And towards the end of this, the second page, morality must precede technology. As before we go using atomic technology, we have to make sure that it's not going to be misused, and that's based on morality. Okay, skipping to the 13th page of this 13-page drasha, he concludes and says, not the very end, but sort of in the middle of the page, the more that he, a human being, surrenders to God, the firmer is his own existence. So it seems that these were drashot given at JTS, not later in his Beit Knesset. When I was at Joint Program, I remember that his weekly Friday night drashot were a highlight of the week, of course. These are Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur ones, which I don't recall hearing, but they're probably from before I arrived. But I hopefully will be able to present these with more, make more organization and figure out the timing and be able to present them properly in the future. Let's look at a couple of his letters. This is a letter to Professor Uriel Tal, historian at Tel Aviv University, following the Yom Kippur War. This letter, as well as another two letters, one, I forget now, there were two after the Six-Day War and one after Yom Kippur, or two after Yom Kippur, one after the Six-Day War, to Professor Tal, were published recently by Rav Shalom Matan Shalom, who was working on the archive with me, and they were published online, and I think somewhere on the chat or somewhere you can find the link. Shalom Matan Shalom, in his article about these letters, stressed both Rav Halivni's point that dramatic statement that one cannot be ethical only halfway, and also the obvious parallel to the post-October 7th reality, given that after the Yom Kippur War, Rav Halivni laments, how could we have relied so blindly on Sahal, on the IDF, and not thought of the possibility that perhaps something could go wrong and we could be surprised by our enemies. So I wanted to stress a different point, which is at the end, his rejection of Yeush, of despair, and says the main thing is not to despair. I hate despair, and if despair is ugly by an individual, how much more so by a whole nation, and how much more so call the Chomer ben Benoshel, call the Chomer for Am Yisrael. So perhaps a little bit of reflections of ramifications. Reverberations of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov and Yeush Bolam Klal. One is not allowed to have despair. A much more recent letter to Professor David Ellensonzal, the head of Hebrew Union College, after an honorary doctorate in 2005. Very grateful, Hakarat Tov, with including the line, I also realized how great the unknown is, which fills me with a sense of inadequacy. Again, our Rav's great humility expressed once again. This is an absolutely beautiful letter from Rav Adin Steinsaltz, Zichrono Livracha, responding to Rav Halivni's autobiography. Really beautiful letter, concluding with the words, the struggle and the contemplation, the pain and the hope. This is the message which comes out of this book, in which there is a call to Mamadaka, a small silent voice, which is the voice from above. So really lovely notice. Just important to point out here, in an archive, you're going to have letters that were sent and letters that were received if the person kept them systematically. In our case, I think it's a little hit and miss, but we do have some of both, as well as one more letter, which is of a different category at all, not by or to Rav Halivni, but a letter from Rebbetzin Dr. Tzipora, Weiss Halivni, to Rav Finkelstein after her mother passed away in 1982, thanking him for his compassionate condolences, which includes the dramatic phrase, the question is it worthwhile to be born? Troubled me. So here we see a document which isn't directly reflecting on Rav Halivni, but yes, shedding light on his family and the community around him. Yiddish poems, two Yiddish poems in difficult Yiddish, and also the copies themselves are not great and parts are cut off, so it's very hard to work with. Rav Shalom Matan Shalom is working with these, translating them, hopefully for publication. Rav Halivni in his autobiography lamented that when he came to America, he didn't feel that his Yiddish was good enough for literary purposes. So it's interesting to see that in that context, but it includes, since I'm not going to quote the Yiddish or the Hebrew translation in English, you see here the nostalgia of the post-Holocaust youth transform me into an eagle that can fly, into an instrument that can play. Let my soul hover above the ruins of the life that once was. And it might be interesting to compare these poems to the Yiddish poetry of Rav Avram Yeshua Heschel, who he wrote as a young man in Warsaw before the Holocaust, but also with this kind of neo-romantic taste to them as well. This is a fascinating document, and I am nearing the end. For those of you that are getting impatient, this document appears in several versions in the archives, both handwritten and typed. It is an unpublished lecture on Paul, as he is quoted in the book of Romans in the New Testament. And Rav Halivni speculates that something that he said, this is quite a long document, was essentially using the methodology of the Gezerah Shava that we know from the Yud Gimel Midot, Torah Nidreshet Behem, the 13 hermeneutical principles of Chazal. This is from 1970. And on the right, we see that this was accepted as a lecture by the Society for Biblical Literature at their conference in 1970, and apparently was given as a lecture. What we don't see here, what I'm not showing you, is that this lecture later was written up as a formal article and was submitted to the Journal of Biblical Literature, which is from the same organization, for publication. And while there's no response that was saved in the archives, was apparently never published. So for those who are interested in both New Testament studies and rabbinic exegetical methodology, there may be something of interest to work on here. This was a benediction that Rav Halivni, when he was a professor at Columbia in 1993, gave the benediction at the inauguration of President George Rupp as the president of Columbia University. And in light of what's sadly been going on at Columbia University for a number of us here, our alma mater, since October 7th, I want to focus in on the lines in the second paragraph on the right-hand column. May God grant you the wisdom to distinguish between free speech legitimately exercised as an inalienable human right and speech which is insightful, intended to sow discord, pander not to popularity, but take to heart public criticism. Sadly, Colombia is, it seems to me, not what it was in the good old days. But we will go on. Last document, fascinating. I don't know who wrote this, and I don't know when it was written. I asked Rabbi Ephraim, who told me that the Hebrew that's added in on the left side, the first page, is not Rav Halivni's handwriting. So apparently it was one of his students or one of his research assistants or something like that, a kind of a TA, how to prepare for Dr. Weiss's class, which includes 6 stages. Each stage has numerous sub-stages, including going through all the Rishonim and an interesting collection of Achronim. And the Rishonim are really classic ones. The Achronim, it's interesting to see who's in here. Turei Evan, Orach Laner, Siach Yitzhak, the Tzlach, the Rashash, going through all the Tosafta Kifshuta, which is relevant, Makorim Sorot, asking all the right questions in this after, I don't know, after a few months of preparation, you'll be ready for one class, apparently. So I think everyone should try to learn like this. B'hatzlacha rabah. L'zecher Moreinu v'Rabbeinu Rav Agon Rabbi David Halivni Zatzal Leilui Nishmato. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Leshem. It was very exciting to hear your presentation because it lets us know that there will be more to come. And God willing, we will see it in print in the not too distant future. Thank you all for joining us. Tehi nishmatot tzrura b'tzror hachayim. May the memory of our teacher be bound up in the bond of life and in our memories for as long as we are here. Kol tuv, and thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Price, for leading us through today's program.